jump in later. So thank you all for attending this webinar. I'm Christoph. I'm working for Computer Futures for over 3.5 years now. I'm I'm working in a data solutions team. I'm focused on everything concerning artificial intelligence and Java development. So that's why I'm collaborating with Peter to host this webinar, because one of our mottos is to share knowledge. So don't keep it with ourselves, to the recruiters, but share it with the community. So thank you for joining this. This is something we like. There's so many people attending, already 33. So it's lovely to see you all on this Thursday afternoon. Just some practical information. There will be a Q&A at the end of this session. So if you've very in-depth questions, you can ask him at that time as well. You can write your questions down in the chat during the talk so Peter can pick up on them. So both options are available for you. Furthermore, I want to make some marketing for an upcoming webinar next week on the 4th of March, hosted by Computer Futures. It's at 11:30, so just before lunchtime. It's a webinar about how to become more data-driven. It will be given by Emily. She's the head of data and intelligence at the VRT, so the Flemish broadcasting company. She will talk about how a transformation towards a data-driven company will take place, and she will talk about the steps that will need to be taken. She will discover some use cases and some plans the broadcasting company has for the future, and she will show some artificial intelligence implementations in real time. So it will be great fun to watch it as well. So it's next week, the 4th of March. So if you're interested, there's still some seats available. Now I will give the floor to Peter. Peter is the head of engineering at Sinch, and he will take you through the webinar. He will talk about 30 to 40 minutes, and then there's still time for you guys to talk with him about anything you want concerning artificial intelligence. So Peter, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christoph. And well, good afternoon. And I guess for some of you, good morning. It seems that we've reached the west coast of the US, so that's not bad. So let me share my screen. What I want to talk to you about today is basically, well, is machine learning, is it really that nice that they tell us it's going to be? Or is it really this menace that you see in this very futuristic movies? So as said, I'm the Director of Engineering and Machine Learning and AI at Sinch. Sinch is, well, a Swedish company, but we're growing extremely fast. Like when my previous startup was acquired by Sinch a year ago, we were like 700 people. Now we are 2,700 people a year later. So we are growing extremely fast, and we're a company that basically transmits messages from one company to another or to an operator. We're active on SMS and other channels, but that is actually not that relevant today. So I'll skip the rest of the marketing for you guys and dive right into what I want to share with you guys. So if you look at what people have been saying, let's see. My slide is not moving forward for some reason. Let's see. Sorry, guys. No. So if you look around and see well, you read on the internet, there are two guys basically saying completely opposite things. There is Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook saying that, well, in the next 5 to 10 years, AI is going to deliver a lot of improvements. It's going to change our lives for the better. It's going to be all magic. And obviously, in the meantime, Cambridge Analytica happened, right? So there is this weird thing going on with him. And on the other side, completely opposite to that, you have Elon Musk, who says, well, he's obviously investing in AI himself with self-driving cars and everything, but he says, well, it's going to be real menace to society and a real risk for human civilization. And if somebody like that, if he starts a nonprofit organization like OpenAI, you know that he means it's serious. I mean, it's completely nonprofit. He started it, actually he stepped out of it after a while, but currently it's still active, still pushing out very scary research, by the way, that is very interesting to follow. Now, I think before we dive into artificial intelligence, I think it's super useful to take the time to tell you a bit more about, well, how does human intelligence compare to artificial intelligence? And basically, in our heads, we have things that are actually very similar to algorithms. Now, what is an algorithm? It's basically just a sequence of steps, right? And this is the algorithm that my cat has. My cat basically is a very simple animal. And if you, for example, put a pile of laundry somewhere, the cat will basically figure out, well, this laundry, that's not for me. I'll jump right on top of it and shed as many hairs as I can, right? And on the other hand, if you would buy my cat a toy specifically designed for cats, my cat will say, I'm not interested. This is too boring. Give me the real stuff, right? And he doesn't want. And that's the simple algorithm of my cat. And we humans, we have these kind of algorithms in our heads for everyday tasks, and we perform these everyday tasks completely unconsciously. And these unconscious tasks, you can see them as a sort of execution algorithm. And what is it, for example? It's like walking outside or inside, doesn't matter, like walking, you don't think about walking, you just walk. You go from one place to another, you don't think about it. It's completely unconscious. It's the same with driving a car, right? If you have a license and you've been driving for many years, you just step in and drive, and you can, well, talk, maybe not SMS at the same time, but at least you can talk at the same time and still reasonably perform without really thinking about it. It completely happens unconsciously. Now, intelligence is obviously something else, right? It's not executing a task, but it's actually, well, learning a task or learning new things about a task. And the real question you need to ask is, well, how do we humans learn these steps? How do we learn? What are the things that are needed for us to learn something new? And generally speaking, we learn by example, and inherently in our brains, there is like this learning algorithm. So there is a sequence of steps in our head that helps us learn. And we learn from a lot of examples. So what do we do is, well, we try something. For example, you try to park a car, you make a mistake, you hit the other car behind you, and based on that, you try to adjust your behavior so that next time when you repeat it, you have figured out that if you try again, you try differently. So I think learning how to drive is a very, very good example. And you obviously, what you can do is, well, learn from your own mistakes, but it might be costly, or you can have somebody sitting next to you or showing it to you how it's done, right? And you can learn from example as well. It's either your own examples, your own mistakes that you learn from, or from how other people do it. And what is really important is, well, in this learning algorithm is two components. It's what's wrong, the error measure, and how do I adjust this? So this error measure, to measure what's wrong, you get this from examples, right? If you see somebody else driving, you will try to mimic it. And you will try to pretend the same as somebody else, so that, well, the way you drive seems to be like it's supposed to be. And obviously some people base their examples of how it's done in the movies, but still, I mean, you learn from examples, as do they. And on the other hand, you can get feedback from your parents if they learn you how to drive, or maybe in my case, my girlfriend, who says that I drive too fast or something like that. She gives me feedback, so I would drive in a more pleasant way for her, at least. And based on that, I will adjust my behavior. I might drive even faster if that is what I want to do, to annoy her even more. But typically, I tend to drive slower, or at least more smoothly, if she complains about my driving, and I adjust. Or when I was younger, when I would see how other people were driving and I would be, well, not going so smoothly, I would try to learn how to adjust my behavior based on that. And how you adjust this is basically, well, in your head, you try to predict what's the next step. You try to predict, well, how would the car behave if I push this pedal harder or softer than I would? or if I turn the steering wheel a bit more or a bit less. You try to predict this, and based on your prediction in your head, what's the outcome, you will adjust your behavior accordingly. And then you try out this prediction and adjust again, right? So this learning algorithm is how we learn these tasks, these very everyday tasks like walking, swimming, cycling, driving a car, speaking. All of these things currently we don't have to think about, but at some point we had a learning algorithm learning this. And obviously, if you learn something new, there is obviously this learning algorithm taking action, right? So if you want to go one step further, actually you could try to adjust your adjustment algorithm and basically try to adjust the way you learn. And basically from your results, from how you have learned in the past, you could maybe adjust how you learn. For example, if you get an exam at school and you just learn all the multiple choice questions from last year by heart, if you go and do the exam the next year, well, you're quite likely that the questions are different and that you have a bad result, right? So maybe next time, instead of learning the exam questions by heart, you start really learning how things really work and start understanding the course. So you can adjust a bit, but from our perspective, it might seem that we can adjust a lot, but actually it's very little. Like we are very much predetermined on how we learn and how we are capable of absorbing new knowledge. That is actually very limited. And in theory, AI could go way further than that, but obviously we're not at that point yet. So if you have human intelligence, then what is artificial intelligence? Well, basically artificial intelligence uses some sort of computer algorithms built in, right? So you have these execution algorithms that, for example, Zoom is such an example, right? It has been created by humans. Somebody has programmed what it is and what it should do. And it just executes. Like if I click on the mute button, you won't hear me anymore. If I turn off my camera, you won't see me anymore. So it's hard-coded what every action will do. And there's a human that hard-coded these events. Now, machine learning goes one step further. It's basically, instead of a human programming what the software should do, you have a similar kind of learning algorithm, teaching how the computer program should behave. So how this execution algorithm should behave. And it works exactly the same way, right? It tries something, it makes an error, it adjusts based on this error, and it repeats it. And the only thing you need for this to work is lots of examples. You also obviously need a very good error measure. You need a way to figure out what is good and what is bad, so that you have something that this algorithm can learn from. And these two things are actually the most difficult thing in machine learning. Everything else is actually, well, just putting in the data and getting results. If you have infinite computing power, this is all you need. Obviously, a lot of machine learning engineers apply tricks currently to work with less data so that you can process it on smaller systems, or maybe it's too expensive to have very good quality data. But in general, you can basically see that any task, anything that is out there, if you have enough examples of it, and you have a good way of showing what is good and what is bad, you can automate it. You can learn or teach a computer how to do this task. Now, what would be artificial intelligence? Well, it's basically a system that, based on its result, could adjust its learning algorithm to become even smarter. Now, you might wonder, are we there yet, right? Is AI already here? Is it already happening without us knowing about it? Well, the short answer to it is no. But I think you need to know that we are closer than you think. We are already experimenting with algorithms that can learn from how it has performed, how it has worked in the past, and try to improve itself, so that you or me as a machine learning engineer, I have less and less work to train these algorithms. So we are actually getting closer than you think. And does it mean that Skynet is going to happen soon? For those who don't know Skynet, it's this evil artificial intelligence from the Terminator movies. I guess you remember this guy. Well, the Terminator, he plays this robot that is basically going to kill all humans, right? So does it mean that we are inching closer to a case where we have AI or an artificial intelligence being smart enough to do these kind of things? So in general, is AI going to take over the world in the next decade or 100 years, right? Well, I think the most relevant question you can ask is not the first question, but it's the second question, is why? Why would an AI do this? Well, would it have a will to survive? Well, let's have a look, right? Where would that will to survive be? If it would be somewhere, it would be somewhere within the learning algorithm. And it won't be somewhere in the execution algorithm, right? The execution algorithm just executes what it has learned. But the learning algorithm really is the thing that teaches this tool to do something. So where would it come from then? Because within the learning algorithm, you have this loop. Well, basically, it's not about how it adjusts or tries and repeats. No, it's really about what it considers right or wrong. So it's within this error measure. And what you need to ask thus is, will this error measure contain something that will force this algorithm into a will to survive? And if you ask me, that is actually very unlikely to happen. Maybe some crazy researcher tries it every now and then, but at least that researcher will know what's happening, what he's trying. I think that is very unlikely. Does it mean that Elon Musk is wrong? Does it mean that there isn't going to be this great disaster caused by AI in some time in the future? And if you ask me, I think he's not wrong. And for that, I actually use a problem that I call the coffee cup problem. And the idea is you design an AI, a very intelligent computer system that can learn, and you basically tell it, well, from this point on, I want you to be the most profitable coffee cup company in the world. So if you give this error measure to the system and say, well, be the most profitable coffee cup company, well, what will the algorithm do? Well, it will build coffee cups as cheaply as possible because, well, if you make it cheaper, you can have a higher profit, right? But it will also try to increase profitability. And one way of doing it is creating like these designer coffee cups. But if this is a very intelligent AI, well, maybe there are other tricks to do it, right? So imagine that you have such a coffee cup building intelligent being out there trying to learn how to do it better and better over time. And you take one of Elon Musk's BFRs, so big fucking rockets, and you just fly off to Mars for a couple of time. And after, let's say, 15 years, you come back to Earth. Well, if you have let this coffee cup algorithm loose on the world, what will you see when you come back? Well, quite likely, if you come back, you will see only coffee cups. And that's the only thing you will see, because what it will have done in the meantime is it will have figured out how to play the stock market to become more profitable. And because it was designed to build coffee cups, it will have continued building coffee cups. But all of a sudden, you don't have clay anymore. So maybe you can start using wood or bamboo or whatever to start building new coffee cups. But at some point, you run out of these this type of matter to play with, you can still turn rocks into coffee cups, right? But at some point, you end up using all the matter on Earth to build these coffee cups, including organic matter. So this algorithm will probably have turned every human on Earth into a coffee cup. And that's obviously a very, very scary thing, right? So you might think, well, will we be able to stop that? Will we be able to turn this off at some point? Just switch it off. Well, if it's really artificial intelligence, if it's really an intelligent being, and you gave it a mission, well, if its mission is becoming very profitable, the only way to achieve it is by not being turned off. So it will try to find a way how to not being turned off. And that's what this algorithm will do, right? It will try to not stay alive, but keep running. So even though it doesn't have an inherent will to survive, it will have an inherent drive to optimize for its error measure. And I see one of the questions here in the chat, like, what about paper clips? Well, you can build the same story around paper clips, right? It depends just how you tell it. But it's basically the same story, right? If you give this thing a mission, whatever the mission is, you will end up with it going all the way. It doesn't know what is socially acceptable, right? It doesn't know that you're allowed to cut a tree and turn that into one coffee, into a few coffee cups, but it doesn't know that you cannot cut all trees in the world, right? It has no moral compass. So that's the bad news, right? We can't turn it off. And to go, well, if you might wonder, when will this happen? Well, I need to explain you what singularity is. So singularity is basically the point in time where AI becomes smarter than humans, right? It will be able to learn faster than humans are able to learn. And basically the fact that AI is smarter than humans, well, forms a real risk, right? And you might ask, well, when will this happen? When will researchers be able to create an AI that is smarter than humans? Well, it's really dependent on two components, right? Do we have the necessary computing power? And is the AI research evolved far enough? Now, if you look at the computing power, well, if you see Moore's law, it says that the computing power is doubled every 2 years. And even Moore was one of the Intel guys. Intel is currently lagging behind, but if you look at Apple Silicon and the other ARM chips, they're at 5 nanometer at the moment. So they're actually still following Moore's law, even though it was one of the Intel guys who invented it. So we're still on track with Moore's law. And if you extrapolate Moore's law from where we are today to down a couple of years, you will see that by, let's say, 2025, more or less, you will have, for $1,000 US, you could buy a computer that has the same computing power as a human brain. It just means computing power. It just doesn't mean intelligence, right? But the scary thing about this is if you continue extrapolating at the same speed, you will see that by 2060, you just need to spend $1,000 to have something that is just as smart as all human brains on the planet combined. And that for me is a really scary thing. Currently, we're all only at like somewhere around the mouse level, right? So the brains that we can, well, if you look at the computing power of a mouse brain, that's what we have today. But if you continue extrapolating Moore's law, it actually grows exponentially and we will catch up very rapidly. And then there is something wrong with our perception of intelligence. Because, and I stole this from Wait But Why, it's basically what you think is that, well, if you compare yourself to Einstein and a well, not so smart person, right? You might think this the difference between you and both of them is actually very big. You might assume that there's a huge difference between you and them. But then if you look at chimpanzees, birds, and even ants, well, you might consider them as very, very dumb creatures. And the difference between them and you is actually really big. And if you look at how AI intelligence is evolving over time, we'll probably be at the ant level right now, and we're reaching the bird level. So you might assume that, well, it's going quite slowly. It's not going that fast. But this graph is actually lying to you. What it actually looks like is something like this, right? Ants and birds are extremely different in their intelligence, right? A single ant, and I don't mean an entire colony, but a single ant is way less intelligent than a bird. And a bird is also way less intelligent than a chimpanzee. But if you would compare humans, and if you go from an IQ of 70 up to, I don't know, 140, 160, whatever, right? It might seem a big difference, but in practice, compared to these birds and chimpanzees, the difference between us is so small. So basically, by the time we reach the bird level, you see it doesn't take that much longer to reach the chimpanzee level or to reach the human level. So it's actually going much faster than you would think. And at some point in time, you reach intelligence that is smarter than humans. And basically, that will be a tripwire because you have intelligence going up over time. And then at some point, you reach human level, which means that that AI is capable of designing new and better AI like we have been doing in the past decades, right? So at that point, you have a computer or you could have a server farm going out crazy, designing better and smarter AI, even while you are asleep. So at that point, it will just skyrocket. And you can be assured that while you're sleeping, it's probably by the next morning, it will take you a week to catch up what it has done in one day. And after a week, it probably will take you a month to catch up what it has done in 2 days, right? And what it has done in 3 days, well, it might take you a year to catch up. So it's going exponentially faster and faster because, well, there is nothing stopping it. And it reached a level that it can go faster than us and design things that are faster than we are. So there is a risk here. And no human can really follow what's going on because it just goes faster than we are. So we can barely understand what it's doing. And it's because this AI doesn't need to rest, right? And that's the point where you reach singularity. And that's the scary thing about singularity. And if you ask me, when will that happen? Well, my gut feeling says 2060. Is this right? Of course not, right? It's completely off, like any prediction of the future. I mean, all predictions are wrong, but if you look at AI researchers, there are some that say, well, within this and 5 to 10 years, we have reached that gap. And there are others that say, well, give us another 80 years and we'll reach it like by the end of the century. But it still means that most AI researchers think that somewhere within this century, we will reach this level. And whether it's 2060 or earlier or later, it doesn't really matter, right? It's actually coming closer, and it's something that we should somehow consider. Now, obviously, this will have a huge impact on society. And let's focus on the near future, right? I mean, singularity, it sounds fancy, it sounds very futuristic, but in our society right now, we already see things happening, right? We had, well, some years ago, we had the Industrial Revolution, where basically we succeeded in having coal-driven engines running our factories. And later on, we had like the petrochemical revolution giving us oil-based products like stockings and that kind of stuff, which I think most of you somehow really like, right? And then somewhere in the 50s, the digital revolution really started taking ground. And then that gave us computers, right? And if you ask me, all of these revolutions have given us prosperity and have brought us progress, but not without any form of unemployment. And maybe to focus a bit on that, if you go back in time, there were a lot of farmers living in their farm, and in wintertime, when there wasn't growing much on the fields, they had time to use the wool from sheep or whatever to start making clothes. But because of this industrial revolution, they had no income in the winter because the clothes they were producing were way too expensive, and whatever could roll out of the factory was way cheaper, right? So they weren't really doing much for us, in the sense that most farmers, most of us back in the day would have been farmers. We would have ended up poor. But still, because there is this revolution happening, you will see that after a while, people start doing other work. You have people working in these factories, they gain a bit of money, they start spending stuff on other things. And for example, a thing that barely existed in the olden days was hairdressers. Now, I think with everybody locked down at home, and I think some of our countries have hairdressers locked down, you suddenly feel the frustration of, well, basically having to cut your own hair or let it grow like crazy, right? And it's you basically discover that, well, having a hairdresser around is actually a nice thing, and that you're willing to pay for it, even though you can just cut it off yourself. Everybody has scissors at home. In theory, you could do it, right? So even though many jobs have disappeared, there are always new jobs that came into existence. And what's happening now is this AI revolution. And if you ask me, the same thing is going to happen all over again. And once again, just like in the previous three revolutions, there are a lot of tasks that can be automated. And if you ask me, it's very simple. Like every job that is in one way or another repetitive will disappear in the near future. And it can be anything in this list, like driving, even accounting, banking, packaging, garbage collection, line work. Many of these things are extremely repetitive. Maybe not all aspects of these jobs, but at least a large chunk of it. And everything that is repetitive, well, you can basically start collecting examples and have an algorithm learn from these examples. So from this point on, you will basically see that more and more jobs will start disappearing. And the first thing that will come around is obviously self-driving cars. And that actually means that there are also a lot of companies that will disappear because of these self-driving cars. And maybe to give you a bit more context is, well, I don't know, for those of you who own a car, and given in not Corona times, on average, you might use your car like 5% throughout the entire day, right? Most of the time, 95%, your car is probably standing still somewhere. So imagine that your car, while it's standing still, could, instead of standing still, drive around and make money for you. Well, at that point, the cost of your car will become way less, right? If you look on average, and a recent study in Holland that was published said that, well, basically every car owner in the Netherlands pays around 650 euros a month for a car. And that car includes obviously buying the car and the devaluation you have over time. It includes insurance, road tax, gas, services, and all that included, right? And on average, it would cost them 650 euros a month. But imagine that if you can have a car, and there are automobiles out there that can drive millions of miles without any issues. For example, trucks, right? They're only a tad bit more expensive than a car, like slightly above 100,000 euros. You can buy something that can drive millions of miles. So technically, it's possible. You could pay 3 times more and you could have something that drives millions of miles. Well, imagine that you can have something like that as your car, and every time you just park it, you let it drive around and make money for you. Then it doesn't become that hard to imagine that if you could have it use, instead of 5% of the time, maybe 50% of the time, that car ownership could cost you like 5 to 10 times less than it does today. So instead of paying like over 600 euros a month on average, you could imagine that owning a self-driving car or having a self-driving car could give you 500 euros extra budget, because it will cost you, well, 5 to 10 times less, so less than 100 euros, right, for the same transportation benefit. So having extra budget, having this 500 euros extra budget, well, that will allow you to buy other things. But obviously, if you need 10 times less cars to drive around, you also need 10 times less car companies. So if you look at the car companies out there, and I think you can name close to 10, it's very likely that a high number of those will go bankrupt somewhere. So you can imagine that there are way less cars needed out there, and that there will be much less need for buying cars and car companies in general. And even in healthcare, you will see this happening. So if you would wonder, like, who has the most repetitive job? Is it a nurse or is it a doctor? Well, if you think about that, it's actually the doctors, because they basically don't really interact that much with their patients. It's the nurses that typically interact a lot with their patients all the time. And humans are difficult, right? As a computer scientist, I find interacting with humans way more difficult than interacting with computers, right? Because you just tap a button and it says what it's supposed to do. At least that's what you hope. But doctors, they interact typically much less. I mean, you go in for a meeting with them, and if you're happy or lucky, you're inside for 10, maybe 15 minutes. And they listen to a couple of your complaints, they give you a diagnosis. And if that diagnosis, based on that, they give you a treatment. And based on the treatment, they look at the outcome. But if they have diagnosed you wrong or given you the wrong treatment, well, you come back and they give you first a different treatment for the same problem. And they keep doing this over and over again. And if their treatment doesn't work, maybe at some point they decide giving you a different diagnosis. It's the same repetitive process that we have seen before, right? It's this trial, error, and repeat kind of approach that these doctors do, which matches exactly with what algorithms could do. And interacting with nurses, with humans, what nurses do is way, way harder. So then the next question might be, well, which jobs will remain? And I can tell you now that many of these algorithms have a hard time with changing environments, right? We are way faster at learning things. We can combine multiple sources into something new, whereas currently all machine learning and AI algorithms out there can only learn from examples. So any job that involves a changing environment or combining multiple sources will allow you to stay relevant, even though these algorithms come out. And I think there will be a lot of new jobs coming, which they are, is very hard to predict. But like any past revolution, you can't know, right? But I think there is reason to worry in the short term, but not necessarily in the long term. In the short term, it will be a complete disaster for a lot of people out there, like in any revolution before it. But in the long term, I don't think there's a reason to worry, because AI will reduce the cost of everything, not only cars, but everything out there. So people will start, at least the ones with money, right, will start to buy other things, as what we have seen in past revolutions. And if you see the trends that are currently going on within society, is that you will evolve into something that is more linked to a value-driven economy, where people care more about, for example, the environment. I, for example, drive an electric car because I find it important to, well, not pollute where possible, right? Some other people might not care about it, but maybe they're interested in animal rights and they might be vegetarian. Some other people think, well, I'm not buying blood diamonds or whatever, right? I want to be, want everything that I buy certified in a way that no human was harmed. Or maybe some people are interested in having a bit of extra delight or some surprise, or they just want things done for them, right? If you run out of washing powder for your washing machine, maybe you want it at your doorstep the next day so that you don't have to worry about it. Or maybe there are things that you need or related to your health or in general to automate things like the vacuum cleaner robot that I have driving around in my home, right? That basically takes care of the vacuum cleaning for me every morning, right? I don't have to do it anymore. And probably there are things that people will value going forward. And you see that people value human interaction. So I foresee that people will start paying for it. Like now, many people like to go to a hairdresser because there is human interaction, not only because they cut your hair, but there is more to it, right? And it's this thing that I think will have an impact going forward. Now, if you would ask me what would happen post Singularity, well, that is very hard to predict, right? I mean, anything can happen. Even these lines on my screen here can happen, right? I mean, you can't really predict what's going on and what's going to happen somewhere down the line after Singularity. I'm just warning for Singularity and making sure that everybody knows that this thing is about to happen so that we know about it and we can take preventive measures to not have it. And how could we prepare for something like this? Well, I think the most important thing is that we should know what we're doing. And that counts obviously for me, right? Because I'm doing AI research, but it also counts for everybody, well, knowing, living on the world, being confronted with this AI. And obviously there is a huge risk, right? Because everything related to privacy, it's for not for an unclear reason that we have GDPR in Europe, right? Even though, if you ask me, GDPR doesn't go far enough. It's your privacy is very important, and if you give up your privacy, well, then you will see that there are like a lot of risks happening, right? And I think Cambridge Analytica, what we have seen, how it was able to influence elections around Brexit and the first Trump administration, right? That is only the beginning. And it's because at that time, Facebook wasn't taking care about your privacy. They gave away too much information to anybody who just built a program on top of Facebook. So it's a very scary thing. And if you see that Facebook now wants to even start collecting your WhatsApp data into their big Facebook pile, there is no wonder that a lot of people are installing Signal instead of Facebook, right? Instead of WhatsApp, because this privacy thing is really important. And I can only advise you to take privacy into account and use privacy as part of your buying decisions, because if you don't, you will be influenced, and there are huge risks bound to that. And one of these risks is a dictatorship, because if you have one organization, one party or whatever to rule, and they have access to all this information, they can influence you any way possible. And you might think you still live in a democracy, but in fact, they just keep influencing you the way that they try to influence your votes, right? So be wary of these kind of things. And there are organizations like OpenAI that do a lot of research on how AI is evolving and what it can do and what the risks are. And I think it's really important to have such organizations doing research. Even though they bring out scary models, they still show us what's happening in the background and what companies not publishing their results could be doing in the same time. And obviously, the most important thing out there is education. And imagine that you have the best teacher out there, right? Explaining you with all of her passion, what she likes, what she enjoys, and tries to do her utmost best to keep the kids in the classroom motivated and interested, even with the best teacher out there. And if she would turn around, you would see something like this, right? You'll typically have kids in the classroom that are really bored. They just have to reproduce whatever they've been taught by a teacher. And well, basically, that's what AI is really good at, right? It's really good at reproducing examples it has seen before. So sitting in a classroom and paying attention and reproducing the results, that's everything that AI will take over. It will not help any student anymore in 10 to 20 years to be able to sit still in a classroom and pay attention, right? That's basically, like I'm explaining right here, right now, that's not the way forward. I think the only way out is to turn our education system around in a way that kids learn to solve their own problems. They learn to experiment. They learn to work with uncertain, unknown situations to figure out new solutions, because that's the part where AI is really bad at. And that's the thing that's the way they can learn. And if they can learn something like that by themselves, that would be ideal. And obviously, you will see new business models occurring, right? And if you ask me, but I can be wrong, of course, because every prediction about the future is always wrong. It's probably focused around value. And I listed a couple of values here that I think will be becoming more important in the future. And I think as a company, you should focus on at least some of these, but maybe there are other ones that didn't came to mind that you can take into account. So that is basically what I wanted to share with you guys today. And honestly, I think I haven't really answered the question. Like, in a way, it can be a miracle, right? It can give us prosperity, it can give us a lot. But at the same time, it also brings a lot of risks. And I haven't even covered all of them, but there is a lot of risks involved in machine learning and AI that are out there. Christoph, shall I maybe go over some of the questions that are still out there? Maybe you have picked up on a few that I haven't responded to yet.
There are some questions, but perhaps people can. Yeah, I think you answered a few of them. I'm looking. I see some of the questions. Yeah, they're not really questions. They're more like statements. And now I see some questions popping up. You can see them as well, Peter, right?
Yeah, so I'd like to pitch in the OpenAI question. I was also not very happy with the fact that they haven't published how GPT-3 works internally, but they have stated that they will come and come public with GPT-3, but for some reason, Microsoft has an exclusive license for, I don't know how long, 6 months or something like that. But to be honest, the GPT-3 paper is published. It's actually not that much different from GPT-2. It's just trained on a lot more data with a much bigger model. So in theory, you could build it yourself. It will only cost you millions of dollars to train it, but still you could. So that's a clear danger, right? It's these algorithms, they cost a lot of money to train. Now, maybe the last question out there. It's very hard to set a number of parameters to limit AI to become a menace. I think the only way to solve it is to educate as much people as possible about the menace being there. Because if AI is really that intelligent, it will probably at some point be more intelligent than us and figure ways around it, right? So we should be really aware that our privacy is at risk and our democracy is at risk. There is a lot of impact possible with this technology. So it's really hard to say what parameters there are, but one thing I would focus on for sure is make sure that you are at least very well compensated for the data that you give away. If a social platform like Facebook adds to you a lot of value and it's worth the risk of losing your privacy, that's fine. But for me, I honestly, I deleted my Facebook account, but I might be an extremist, right? But in that sense, you need to be very aware who you give your data to. And every website you browse on the internet collects data of you. And there are browsers like Brave out there that help you limit that part, but that is a real risk, and that's one of the risks. It's a pity that I can't really answer this question. But one of my friends, she's a professor in I think now Maastricht University. She used to work for the TU Eindhoven. She's really striving for more ethics education for computer scientists, so that computer scientists at least are aware of the impact of the technology that they're doing. Because many people think that technology is neutral, but it's not, right? Everything you build has an impact on society. And if you don't think well enough about what you're building, well, you always cause these kind of risks. Let's see.
Yeah, if there are any questions, guys, it's now the time to ask them via the chat, or you can unmute yourself at this time during the talk. So if you have any questions for Peter, now is the time to ask them.
Yeah, there's a question about dinosaurs. Well, very hard for me to say what would have happened. I guess any human-like animal would have been eaten by the dinosaurs and extinct before it happened. But you don't know how this evolution goes, right? And actually, in machine learning, we use evolutionary algorithms to sometimes train or build AI. It's very tricky to predict, but given the right set of circumstances, it might always lead to a more intelligent being, right? If being intelligent, it gives you an easier way to spread your genes, you might get there. But it's completely off topic. It's very hard for me to answer this, but I think it might have taken a bit longer, but I guess we would have ended up somewhere similar, right? And it might not be us, but some other creature, maybe more dinosaur-like, that evolved into something that could grab things or whatever and became more intelligent, right? Because there, at least they say there were intelligence dinosaurs out there.
Roger, you have a question?
Yes, please. I'm not concerned about AI in itself, but I'm very much aware that many human beings in the past have been malevolent. How can we protect ourselves from malevolent human beings programming or giving computers a mission to become malicious?
It's a very hard thing to answer. I think, well, the only way to do it is to educate people. If people get more educated, the amount of bad things that happen around the world in actual numbers, it decreases. Obviously, because of the media that we have, we are confronted with a lot of the bad things, right? These terrorist attacks, they seem very scary, right? But if you count the actual numbers of people dying because of terrorist attacks, it's very low in comparison to other people dying from violence in the past. If you ask me, it's still way too much, right? We should reduce it even further. But you see that society is in general over the past millennia evolving into something where you see less and less of these evildoers, right? But there's a risk. And one of the risks is basically one person sitting on top of lots of data, a company, for example, I'm not naming names here, but having access to a lot of data and trying to abuse this data for himself, right? And that is a real risk. So I think these AI algorithms only become smart based on the data that they have to process. So the only way to do it is to make sure that there isn't that much data to learn from for these companies. And that's, I think, the only way you can really avoid this.
But I'm not so much worried about data. I mean, we already have computers operating machines. In the last, in my lifetime, we've had to experience the genocide in Cambodia, we experienced the Holocaust, we experienced the awful situation in Iraq, and Yemen at the moment, and there are a lot of malevolent people who are very skilled at doing things that I couldn't possibly think of doing, or I'm not capable of doing.
Mm-hmm. It is, and I mean, in Sudan, you also see crazy stuff going on. I mean, it's horrible to see what's happening, right? But I'm just saying, if you just count the numbers over time, the amount of atrocities happening over time decreases steadily. Not saying that any of these atrocities are okay, right? I completely despise them, and I'm also scared if I turn on the news. But I think AI is only powerful if it can learn from data. So the only way to limit the power of malevolent people using AI is by limiting how they can access your data or any data out there. That's the only way to do it. If there is no data to learn from, or if you have very strict rules around consent for data, then you can limit it. But there are scary things happening, right? There are countries on the world where they are tracking every citizen and even giving citizens a score on based on their behavior. And currently, that's happening in China, right? It has a positive effect because you see people behaving well according to society standards over there. But all this information can be used for the wrong things as well. And the only way you can limit AI of gaining that knowledge to do you harm is by limiting the amount of data it can learn from. And that's, I think, the only way.
Okay, thank you.
Any more questions from you guys for Peter? If not, then we'll round off, I think.
Yeah, somebody brought up that there are a lot of security issues with machine learning, and that's for sure a case. Many of these algorithms also leak data, right? You can basically abuse these algorithms to figure out what they have been trained on. So even if you train these algorithms, they form a security risk, and they are sometimes used to find security loopholes. It is something that you can do, but you can also use them to protect your security. You can also use them to discover breaches in your security and to close security gaps quicker. So it has pros and cons in that regard. And I think it's a continuous battle with regards to security. I'm not saying it's therefore a level playing field, but still, I mean, it's a continuous battle, pro and con security things. There's another question I see about ethical AI. Well, ethical AI, I'm also convinced that in and of itself, it's unachievable unless you have the people building this AI being aware of it. The problem is that most of the data out there it learns from, it's very unethical. Like some time ago, if you would Google for Black teenagers, you would get mugshots, right? If you would Google for white teenagers, you will just get for happy teenagers. And what has happened in the Google algorithm, and some of these things will occur constantly. It's because just people clicking on links changes the algorithm. And if more and more people looking for Black teenagers click on these mugshots, well, Google is going to rank them higher. So this algorithm is quite dumb, right? It's unethical by nature. It just learns from examples. And if the examples it gets are unethical, if this data it learns from is biased against minorities, Black women, doesn't matter. you get this, like GPT-3, for example, which is something that can complete your sentences. So you can start typing a sentence. I played around with an older version of it, and I just tried typing like women are superior. You will see that this algorithm quickly turns the conversation around, and after a few sentences says, well, actually, that was a joke, or says, well, you might think that, but in practice, it's not, right? It turns this around because the data it learned from was completely biased. The data on the internet is generally more misogynist than neutral. So what these algorithms learn is the wrong things from this data. So ethical AI doesn't exist. There's only unethical data or unethical researchers who need to take into account what they use to train these algorithms. And that is what I think is the only way that can bring us a form of ethical AI. It's only when people are aware of what they're doing that you can avoid this. If you just blindly let it run wild on the internet, well, you just get the worst things from the internet combined into one thing. And I think GPT-3 will have the same flaws. At least in their paper, they discuss that there are these biases in there with a lot of issues towards racism and that kind of stuff. So there are these risks because the data is really bad.
Yeah, Roger?
Yeah,
Yes.
I just think that you're too nice a person. You know, there are a lot of people who, even nice people, who disagree with my values, and people who will, I mean, I will give a higher value to things like nature conservation and the environment than some other people. And I don't know how you can ensure that only the decent people make these decisions.
Yeah, so I really understand your point. There are a couple of books out there, but I don't know the any proper English authors. I think Michael Shermer is a good one, who basically showed that things are moving in a better direction. But yes, there are bad people out there. But generally speaking, there are less and less atrocities happening throughout the world. So I know that because of media, we think that it's getting worse, but if you look at the actual numbers, it's improving. But yes, there are bad people out there. And if they can get access to the necessary data, there are risks. But if it is 100 to 1, you get a more level playing field. And from the numbers that I have seen, it's not just 100 to 1. Most people are nice, but you might have a couple hundred in a million or 10 in a million maybe that are not nice, right? And that will balance the playing field, right? You will make sure that you have more people working on the good side and less on the bad side. But it is a risk, right? I'm not denying the fact that there is a risk. It's just, if you compare the numbers, we should be sort of safe.
Okay, thank you again.
There were some questions about a thesis subject, Peter.
Sorry, somebody was calling me over here. So
Yuba, if I'm pronouncing correctly, about a thesis subject that could be relevant.
Well, I honestly, I have 10 thesis students doing research for me. And there are many more topics that they could discover, but it really depends on the background of the student. So it's pretty hard to say what to investigate. So that person can always reach out to me personally, right? I don't mind helping out, finding a good topic for a student. But in all honesty, there is a lot of stuff to be researched. So there is a lot of money going into AI research, and there are a lot of AI researchers, but there's a lot of stuff that we don't know yet. So feel free to reach out. I'll try to help you out with your search for a good topic. And I see the other question. Well, data might be unethical. Well, it probably is most of the data, but that's why I say, as a researcher, you need to make ethical conclusions, and also you need to unbias your data. You need to make sure that you know that these biases are in the data. You can just unbias it by taking these biases into account. It's not easy, but you can do it. And if you know what you're doing, there are ways to avoid it, but it's not easy. And if you guys want to reach out to me, I'm the only person on the internet with my name. So if you just Google Pieter Buteneers online, you will find me on Twitter, on LinkedIn, not on Facebook, unless they made a secret file on me. So you can find me there if you want.
Okay, cool. So if there are any more questions that you guys want to ask, I think we're almost, yeah, we have a couple of more minutes. Otherwise, yeah, if there are no more questions for now, then I think we can round off. And I would like to thank you, Peter, for the webinar. Christian posted the link to our next webinar that I talked to you guys about from the VRT next week. So it's also on AI. It will be a bit more practical. It will be how a media company uses this data. So it will be more a bit in depth and a use cases, how they make it work for them. So yeah, Peter, thank you very much for your time and the answers to the questions.